I was like, yeah, I read all 300 issues, and he actually gave me a little like paper medal. It says like 300 in, and then I was like, yeah, but I skimmed towards the end. He's like, so did I. It's like I worked on the comic. So anyway, so the horror, comic books, censorship, and the comics code. So whoop, there we go. All right, so to begin, we have the golden age of comics. This is the era roughly between 1938, when comic books first sort of took their modern formats as we know them, into 1954 with the institution of the Comics Code Authority, which you're going to learn about over the course of this presentation. So obviously in the early days of comics, superheroes were king. That was the big thing. They were, just as they are today, kind of inextricably linked to the comic book. There were many other genres in comics at this time, but superheroes were the big deal. They were the most popular genre by far. However, by the early 1950s, the popularity of the superhero comic was waning, and many other genres started to gain popularity instead of superheroes. So by the 1950s, 90% of American kids read comics. And notice I didn't say 90% of American boys. I said 90% of American kids, girls and boys across the board, read comics. This is pre-television. Most people didn't have a TV. So this is a nice form of visual entertainment. Inexpensive. They were 10 cents. And throughout, up until mid-1950s, I was like 10 cents for like 48 pages. So for like less than a quarter, you had an afternoon's worth of entertainment. And they could easily be traded among friends. In fact, has been estimated that for every issue of a comic sold, between 5 and 10 kids read that issue of a comic because they got traded and swapped around so much. So some of the genres that became popular in the 1950s were teen humor comics like Archie, which somehow has become the basis of a successful teen drama, Riverdale, but teen humor comics, romance comics, funny animal comics, war comics, science fiction comics, Western comics, and of course, science fiction, Western war comics. One of my favorite things about this is that Space Western and Cowboy Western are actually the same comic. It's just 1 month they switched format. They went from Cowboy Western to being Space Western. That was actually by and a lot of smaller companies like Charleston, who is one of the lower rent companies throughout the 1960s. They would just kind of chase whatever genre was popular. In fact, before Marvel became Marvel and was known as Atlas, they just kind of jumped on to whatever was popular throughout the 1950s. So another emerging genre that became very popular during this time was the true crime comic. People love these sort of salacious tales of violence and people doing bad things. And along with the true crime comic came the even more horrifying horror comic. As you can see, these were tailored to have covers to make mom and dad be grossed out. And it was these true crime and horror comics that really got the attention of a psychologist by the name of Frederic Wertham, who published a book called The Seduction of the Innocent in 1954. Now, comic books were already kind of under scrutiny by the public, by parents groups, already sort of seen as this sort of bad influence on kids at the time, you know, sort of the same way video games are today. And so Wertham didn't start that, but this book certainly became sort of a rallying cry. So what inspired Wertham to do this? Wertham, again, he's often painted as like a villain in these stories, but he actually, his heart was in the right place. I think that's one of the things to remember with him. He actually became aware of this issue when he was he had a free mental health clinic like in Harlem, where he worked with, you know, today we would call at-risk youth, but at the time they called juvenile delinquents. And he worked with all these kids that were sort of problem kids, and he was noticing whenever he asked them what they read, they would all say comic books. So if you, in my 400 class, you know that this is an example of correlation, not causation, the post hoc fallacy, right? So, because remember, 90% of the kids in America were reading comic books. If comic books really caused juvenile delinquency, you'd have 90% of the kids being juvenile delinquents, which again is why so many people were scared by this. So, among some of the accusations he made in the book, crime and horror comics were how-to manuals for murder and violence and torture. Romance comics threatened the sanctity of the family unit. There was this Superman complex where, because Superman, you know, beats people up and can't get hurt himself, there's this, he claimed that there was this desire by children to want to see others harmed while they themselves were not harmed. He claimed that Batman and Robin were gay. And the exact quote, which I'm going to come back to because it's often taken out of context, but it relates to some of the things that Wertham did in his research that weren't on the up and up. But the quote was, the Batman and Robin were a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. Wonder Woman had underlying themes of bondage and sadomasochism. This one is actually true. That's a different presentation altogether. But if you're interested in learning about it, you can look into it. There's actually a movie about this and the rather unconventional home life of Wonder Woman's creator, who was a psychologist by the name of William Marston. And the movie, I believe, is called Dr. Marston and the Wonder Woman, with his, which is about he and his wife and their shared lover and their relationship, and how the relationship with those two women inspired Wonder Woman. He also claimed that Blue Beetle was a Kafkaesque nightmare. Now, this Kafkaesque is, of course, probably a reference to Franz Kafka's most famous story, The Metamorphosis, which some of you may have read, about a man turned into a giant cockroach. However, those of you that know comics know that Blue Beetle is just a guy in a costume, you know, just like Batman is not really a bat. So this kind of tells me that maybe Frederic Wertham hadn't even bothered to read an issue of the Blue Beetle before he made this assertion, and just sort of decided just by looking at the title that must be what it's about. So this video, this was actually released after the Comics Code was already in place, but this would have been, show confidential file, this would have been like Dateline or 60 Minutes. It would have been a show of that type at the time. But this gives you an insight into what sort of the public view of comics was at this time.
This, for instance, is an 80. But there's an immense backlog still in the warehouses and on the newsstands. Unless the individual communities find out where they are and get rid of them, these books will be around for years. There are about 60 million. That's 60 million comic books published every month in the United States. But those figures are really quite vague, and you'll see why. Ask 10 kids where they got the comic book they read.
I don't think there's audio in the video.
Yeah, I'm not able to hear it either.
So, are you guys not getting audio on the?
No.
At first
Vicky,
I was, then
Vicky,
it's-
Vicky, are you getting audio?
At
No,
first,
it was there
but-
for a second and then now it's gone.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I muted myself, so maybe that's what it is. So let me.
You need
Try
to
that
enable
over.
it through the.
You must have been hearing it through just my speakers. I don't know why it's not giving you audio. So, but here I'll unmute. Just let it play that way if you guys could hear it. Whoop. Nope. Can you hear it now?
Yes, I can hear it now.
Yeah,
Wait.
just
Barely.
Yeah, not really, Scott. It's just not coming in good.
try one more thing here. So we stop share. Let me try sharing it as though I'm actually sharing a presentation. Can you hear it better?
It's still too quiet.
Still just coming through my microphone?
Yeah.
Let me see something. So, well, what I'll do is you guys can just kind of watch it, but one of my favorite things that happens here is like my friends and I, we used to hang out, but we never spent an afternoon like this reading, you know. It's like he does qualify. You know, say it'd be great if they were reading something worthwhile, but instead they're reading, you know, he talks about the various, trashy things they're reading. But even watching this, and I'll skip through, you can kind of see like the whole narrative here is that they get, these ideas for like things they can do to each other from reading the comic book. And these kids read this comic book and they decide to take the little kid and tie him up. And here, this is, that they're tying up and they're going to torture him because they got the idea to do it from reading the comic book. And my favorite thing is he goes, "I'm not suggesting the comic books cause this kind of behavior." I was like, no, you're just strongly implying it, but yeah, it's really disturbing. And another thing about this was actually, this short was directed by a young Irvin Kershner, who directed my favorite movie, one of the greatest sequels of all time, RoboCop 2. And he also directed a little movie called The Empire Strikes Back, part of something called Star Wars. But I'm pretty sure if you asked him, he directed that short for the same reason he directed RoboCop 2, was they paid him a lot of money. But he directed that as a young director before he went on to actually direct some pretty good movies. So anyway, it's just skipping through the video now. So, all right. So you can kind of see that what the sentiment was, how horrified people were of comics and the effect they were having on young people. And so the Wertham book just sort of served as a lightning rod for that controversy. And it got to the point where on April 21st, 22nd, and June 4th of 1954, Senator Estes Kefauver held public hearings on the effect of comic books on youth before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency. By the way, also at the same time, juvenile delinquency was a real concern in the 1950s. So they had a whole subcommittee on this. Wertham was their expert witness. The only person to testify on behalf of the comic industry was Bill Gaines. So a little bit about Bill Gaines. His father, Maxwell Gaines, was one of the men that we could say invented comic books, invented the modern comic book. In fact, he helped co-found National Comics, which today most of us know as DC Comics. And then he later went on to start his own company, which he called, originally it was EC Comics, originally standing for Educational Comics, and they predominantly just did like illustrated Bible stories. That was kind of the main thing that they did, retelling old folk tales and stuff. Well, Maxwell Gaines died in sort of a freak boating accident, and his son, Bill, took over his publishing company. And Bill didn't know the first thing about publishing, but he'd inherited his father's business. And he came in, and unlike most comics publishers, he was the same age as the guys that were writing and drawing the comics, maybe just a little bit older, but he was more of a peer to them. And so the first thing he does is he goes in and he's like, well, I don't know anything about comics. He's like, what are you guys doing? They're like, oh, we draw Bible stories. And he's like, do you guys want to draw Bible stories? They're like, hell no. And so he's like, well, what kind of stories do you guys want to tell? So that led to the development of EC's new trend. So they did become one of their most popular comics were the horror comics, but they also had some very popular science fiction titles. They did true crime. They did some romance stuff. Bill Gaines was particularly proud of his war comics. In fact, he often lost money on the war comics, and he said, I'm fine with that because I'm making plenty of money off the horror comics. But he was really proud of the war comics because at this time in the early 1950s, he had guys that had only a few years earlier served in the Second World War. Some of the younger guys were coming back from Korea, and they were telling these true stories about what war was really like, and the horrors of war. And he felt those were important stories to tell. So he's very proud of those comics. Also, a few other things about Bill Gaines, again, being more the same age as the guys in his staff that were writing and drawing the comics for them. He was much nicer to them. He paid the best page rates and the best rates for stories in the industry at that time. It's often been joked about that he could be simultaneously the biggest tightwad on the planet, but also one of the most generous human beings at the end of the day. There's a story where one of his editors asked for a raise, and he's like, well, I'll tell you what, let's go out to dinner and discuss it. And basically takes him out to dinner. They go have dinner at a really expensive restaurant and go to a Broadway show and go out for drinks afterwards. He's like, you know what, I'm not going to give you the raise. And he's like, boss, you spent more money than the raise would have cost on this evening. He's like, well, I like going to shows. I like going out to eat. I don't like giving people raises. And then 6 months later, he gave him the raise anyway. But that's the kind of guy Bill Gaines was. So he had, so obviously when you have the best page rates and you pay the best rates at that time, you get the best writers, you get the best artists. So the EC comics of that time were just so head and shoulders above the rest in terms of their quality. Bill Gaines used to, well, in a very strange move, he would offer the original art back to the artist after the comic was printed. And they were like, nah, they didn't know it was going to be worth anything. And Bill would keep it. And they're like, Bill, what are you going to do with all that art? He's like, I'm going to sell it one day and I'm going to make a fortune. And well, several years much later, when these comics were seen as being very valuable, he did sell all that original art and he did make a small fortune from it, which he split with the artist and their surviving family members. So that's the kind of guy Bill Gaines was. He was a very, very nice guy. He's sort of the hero of our story. But again, he had the best writers and the best artists in the business. So when you have the best writers coming up with the most sick and twisted ideas they can come up with for these horror stories and crime stories, illustrated graphically by the best artists, in the industry, you get stuff that's guaranteed to freak out mom and dad. So, as I say, he was the only guy. He became one of the poster children. EC Comics was the poster child for bad comics. So he was the only guy to testify at the hearing on behalf of comics. Now, I will say he comes in, he has a beautiful defense talking about freedom of speech, but also it was well researched. He cited all the psychologists that disagreed with Wertham, which was the consensus at the time was by most of the psychological community was that no, comic books really had little to no effect on children, and their behavior. The same way as that the consensus of the psychological community in regards to video games is that video games alone are not going to impact a child's psychology. So he goes and he cites all the psychologists that say that comic books are not harmful. He disputes Wertham. He has an impassioned defense of comics. But something about Bill Gaines, you might have noticed he was kind of a big dude. And so he was trying to lose weight. And in the 1950s, you did that by taking diet pills. And of course, today we know that diet pills are actually speed. They're amphetamines. And so he'd taken some diet pills before his testimony. And when it came time for the cross-examine, he was crashing. He was coming down off the pill. So he was just sweating profusely. And he wasn't thinking as well as he could have been. And they kind of tore him apart on the cross-examination. So you have the guy questioning him. So he says, well, there will be no limit to what you would put in these magazines, only within the bounds of good taste, your own good taste and salability. Bill Gaines says, yes. Senator Kefauver says, here's your May 22nd issue of crime suspense stories. Do you think this comic is in good taste? Bill Gaines says, well, yes. For the cover of a horror comic, I think it's in good taste. They say, well, what would be in bad taste? He's like, I don't know, if they was holding the head a little higher and it was dripping blood, or you could see where it was disconnected from that. And so, yeah, it just really fell apart from there, and they just kind of tore him to pieces because he was just so flustered by that point. So at that point, the comics industry, fearing government censorship, in fact, comic books have come closer than any medium to having the federal government actually step in and regulate the content of the medium and say what they could and could not publish. Because other things like film and television have really had much more of a hands-off approach. Like, for example, the FCC, there are things like FCC violations for obscenity, but they don't define what obscenity is. The 7 words you can't say on TV, that's broadcasters decide that. The federal government does not decide that. The private companies decide that. Same thing with like the ratings system in film. So, but comics came, because it involved children and the welfare of children, they came the closest to any other medium to actually having their content dictated by the federal government. So fearing that, the comics industry introduced the Comics Code Authority. This is a super strict code of approval that you had to meet before you would get this stamp. Now, comics could still be sold if they did not have this seal of approval on them. It wasn't, at least there were no federal laws against it. There might have been a local ordinance or something like that. But for the most part, at that time in the 1950s, if a kid's buying comic books, he's not going to a comic book store like you would today. He's going to a newsstand or a drugstore. He's basically going to a merchant who just has comic books as part of his revenue, and he doesn't want that. In other words, he doesn't want parents protesting and like boycotting him or anything like that. So what he's going to do in order to avoid their protest is he's going to make sure that all the comic books that he gets have this seal of approval on it. But it was very strict. It was basically anything would have to be a soft G rating, First of all, you could no longer have words like horror or terror or fear in the title of a comic. You could not have zombies, the undead, werewolves, or vampires. So that pretty much eliminates horror comics as a genre. You couldn't have criminals must always be punished for their crimes. So there go your crime comics. Police and government officials, must always be seen in a positive light. So for your crime comics, you can't have a crooked cop anymore. Police, government, also the military must always be shown in a positive light. So now Bill Gaines can't do war comics the way he wanted to do war comics. And so Frank Miller once said that the code seemed like it was almost written specifically to put Bill Gaines out of business. But it was very, very strict. You could not, so many things you could not do under the code. So Bill Gaines did try to continue to produce comics under the code restrictions for a few years. But one of the last straws, or at least one of them, was from this story called Judgment Day, which, by the way, I learned here that it was published earlier than 1956. It was originally published before the code in 1953, but they went to reprint it in a comic in 1956, and it came back, the code rejected it. And what the story is about, it's about this astronaut who throughout the comic, he's wearing a helmet, and we cannot see his face under the helmet. And he's going to visit this planet of robots for potentially like forming an alliance with Earth. If you're a Star Trek fan, he was going to see if he wants to let them in the Starfleet, right? And learns that there are orange robots and there are blue robots on this planet, and the orange robots discriminate and are prejudiced against the blue robots. Obviously, in 1950s, this is meant to be an allegory for the racism in our own country. So at the end of the issue, at the end of the story, the astronaut removes his helmet, and it's revealed that it's a black man. And again, they published the story in 1953, but when they tried to reprint it underneath the comics code, it came back, change the astronaut, he can't be black. They said, wait a minute, hold on, there's nothing in the code that says he can't be black. Now, one of the things, again, as bad as the code was, one of the things that it did stipulate, you could not have racist or stereotypical depictions of minorities in your comic. But I think, as you can see with this image, that was definitely not the intent here. And unfortunately, one of the effects but in order to avoid stereotypically depicting minorities, comics just stopped depicting minorities altogether. There was just no representation. But literally, the comics code people fought him to like remove the number of beads of sweat off of the guy's face, so he wasn't as intimidating looking. And that was sort of one of the last straws for Bill Gaines. So he does have the last laugh. So what he does is he packs up all of his comics. He just folds the publishing end of his comics, but he takes this one comic that he really liked. It was one of his best sellers. It was actually a humor comic that satirized not only comics, but other popular things in pop culture of the day, like Mickey Mouse and other things like that. He made it a little bit bigger, and he made it black and white so that it was now a magazine. He said that it was a magazine, and thus no longer subject to the comics code. And that was, of course, Mad Magazine, which, of course, went on to very famous and influential to comics and humorists for decades. Probably not so much to you guys. I don't think it's been as big a part of your growing up as it was for me. So for better or worse, one of the things that came about because of the comics code is superheroes were on the way out. Really only Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman had remained popular throughout the 1950s. But the comics code was so restrictive that there wasn't much people could do, and so that the companies could do. So DC Comics decided, let's just do superheroes again. And they brought back the superhero with a sort of a rebooted version of The Flash. By the way, you'll note, this is from 1956. Notice the size of, whoop. Notice the size of the Comics Code Authority stamp. I'm going to show you some of my comics in a little bit here, but see how big it is? Because again, at that time, you know, they wanted to make sure the guy stocking it at his newsstand wanted to make sure it was there because he didn't want any trouble. So enter, if it took a hero, our Bill Gaines is our hero, our superhero is none other than Stan Lee himself. So, you know, obviously the return of the superhero is, we would not have Marvel if the superhero had not made a comeback. Because obviously it was their comics that really took the superhero to a whole new level. First with the Fantastic Four and then with other characters as well. So I actually have here, and you'll have to bear with me because even with my progressive lenses, I have trouble reading the print. So this is actually an issue of Spider-Man that I have from, let's see, this is from 1967. As you can see, it has, well, here I'll stop sharing here so you can see me as sort of a full image here. So as you can see, it has the approval code on there. So this is actually Stan Lee got a letter from, I was talking about getting letters from some of the readers of The Amazing Spider-Man, asking what is this Comics Code Authority? Because this is like 10 years later, they might not, these kids might not have remembered what the Comics Code Authority is. Okay, he says, so this was his response. He says, we've often been asked how we, well, the Comics Code Authority, just as the motion picture industry has a self-regulatory agency to ensure the propriety of its product, so too does the comics magazine industry. Any periodical which might contain offensive or unacceptable material cannot win that little stamp which appears on all our covers. It's just as simple as that. Now then, we've often been asked how we at Marvel actually feel about having to submit our masterful yarns to an outside agency for approval. After all, we'll tell you, we're delighted to do it. After all, the Comics Code Authority and your batty bullpen share the same overall objectives. We both want the stories you read to remain within the bounds of good taste. Our creative surge is in no way stifled by this process. Our employment of satire is in no way curtailed, and we enjoy the same elements of literary and artistic freedom as any other practitioners of the arts in any other media. Before we sign off, we'd like to tip our hat to our code administrator, Len Darvin, for his sagacious staff for the truly excellent work they have done in this difficult and often thankless job. Excelsior. Well, if it seems to you guys that Stan was maybe laying it on a little thick there, well, he probably was. In fact, in later years, Stan Lee admitted to constantly butting heads with the Comics Code over stupid little things. One of the big ones was, one of the reasons that the original Incredible Hulk title was canceled was because he was constantly butting heads with them because the Hulk looked too scary. Or in those early Hulk comics, it was the Hulk would fight the army, and it was always just a case of they didn't understand that the Hulk wasn't a bad guy, but still the Comics Code didn't want the Hulk fighting the army, who always have to be the good guys, right? So he was actually constantly butting heads with them. And so if it seems like he was laying it on thick, that's him maybe hoping to grease the wheels so they won't give him as much of a hard time on his comics in the future there. So after Spider-Man proved quite popular, in 1971, the United States Department of Health and Welfare approached Stan Lee to a Spider-Man story about the dangers of drug abuse. So Stan Lee, I've read this story. He said, sure, and it's a very naive story. He doesn't even name the drug in the comic. It's just drugs. It's one of those things. And depending on how he needs to use it in the story, it's either like LSD or PCP, or like when in the story it's Harry Osborn gets hooked on pills. It gets like uppers and downers. And so it's just drugs. It's just vague drugs. And the message it's bad, drugs are bad, and it's actually the backdrop to the main storyline, just some events. Spider-Man beats up a couple of drug dealers, you know. And so they send this to the Comics Code, and they reject it. They say, no, we can't put the code of approval on there. And they're like, well, why not? They're like, because you have drugs in this comic. And Stanley's like, yeah, but it's clearly saying don't do drugs. They're like, still, it's absolute. You cannot do drugs. So Stan Lee goes to his publisher, Martin Goodman, and says, hey, I think we should put them out anyway. So here's the thing. In 1954, so they put out the comics, and, you know, I often ask people, like, what they think happens. Some people are like, well, you know, I think it sold out. And it did, but Spider-Man was very popular. It always sold out. I think a more appropriate answer is, well, nothing really. They kind of put it out. They got some really good accolades for doing an anti-drug story. But in terms of, you know, there was no outcry from parents. People weren't boycotting the stores for not having the code approval. In fact, in the 15, 16 years or so since the code had come into place, people had sort of forgotten about it. Rock and roll had replaced comics as the thing that was corrupting, you know, the youth, right? So that guy who was putting stuff on his newsstand, who in 1954 would have been carefully making sure that stamp was on there. In 1971, he was just like, oh, it's Spider-Man. This is one of my best-selling titles. And he just put it out on the shelf. And so that led to the first real reevaluation and reform of the code since it was first introduced in 1954. First of all, within a year, you could do anti-drug stories. That was okay. And also, this is actually Green Lantern and the Green Arrow, and this is a story in which Green Arrow's sidekick, his sort of the Robin to his Batman, if you were, gets addicted to heroin. And ironically enough, his sidekick's name is Speedy. So I don't. So it's kind of weird. But also it's something just to show you how they reformed it. Yeah, you would not even be able to show the hypodermic needle. There were many cases of origin stories for characters where you couldn't do an injection like of a formula. You had to drink it because you could not show hypodermic needles under the Comics Code. Yeah, so within a year, you could obviously do anti-drug stories. They also pulled it back a little bit where you could do horror as long, and their words were, as long as it was like in the tradition of like Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley's Dracula, which of course led Marvel Comics to introducing both Dracula and Frankenstein as characters in the Marvel universe. In fact, if you know the character Blade, who is eventually going to be in the Marvel universe, but he was actually created to fight Dracula in the Marvel Comics. So throughout the 1970s, another factor that sort of influenced the code having a declining importance was the fact that you saw more specialty comic book shops emerge during this time. So you no longer had to buy it off of the newsstand. You no longer had to worry about parents complaining to the guy who was just trying to had one part of his income, right, being these comic books. You could sell them directly to people who specifically wanted to buy comics, and particularly towards maybe older people who didn't want, you know, the watered down comics. So in 1984, it was a horror comic, The Swamp Thing, which was one of the first mainstream comics to begin submitting newsstand comics that went to the newsstand without even bothering to submit the comics to the code for approval. I believe they'd had a few issues where they kind of butted heads and decided to put some out anyway. But then they just eventually, you know, we're not even going to submit them to the code because we don't need to. It had become such sort of a non-issue by 1987 that I can't even find. I know that the Frank Miller, Dave Mazzucchelli 4-part story that originally appeared in the main Batman comic, Batman Year One, and was originally published in the main Batman title that you could buy on newsstands. it didn't have it does not have Comics Code approval. That is, I own these issues. It's not anywhere on there that they were approved by the code. I can't find anything online that mentions this, like whether that was they submitted them and they were rejected, or they just decided to run them without code approval, which at that time, Frank Miller, that might have been something that he asked for. You know, he had enough clout to do that. And there is certainly content in the comic which may have been rejected. So you can actually visually see the lessening importance of the code on the comics themselves. So I pointed out to you there was that Flash comic with the Flash comic and how big the stamp was on it. But here's one that I have. So this is actually an EC comic. One of the things Bill Gaines tried to do was pirate comics. So if you've ever read Watchmen, and you're like, why is there a pirate comic in here? That's because Bill Gaines did try to do them. But see how big the stamp is there? So then by the 1960s, this is Batman, this is 1966, so it's a little smaller, right? So we're gonna get to, let's see, 1970s. Yeah, it's even smaller. By the 1980s, both Marvel and DC, it had actually gotten so small that they just kind of made it part of the pricing and like the publication and like date. You can kind of see there. Yeah, it's on there, and here's one. Yeah. And then in the 90s here, it's like they're even like putting, it's like the same color as the background there. So yeah, it was becoming less and less important. Also, so notice the cover of this comic. We have a naked Wolverine with some strategically placed bits of technology there covering up his, you know, naughty bits, as well as what's obviously a very, very violent scene on the cover of this comic. Then we go inside and we have a naked and bloody Wolverine. You know, and we have our villain here who's with the bloody stump. I don't know if you can see there. The bloody stump where in the previous issue, Wolverine cut off one of his hands. And yes, naked Wolverine. There's Wolverine's butt right there in the shot. And I would like to say all of that and still approved by the Comics Code Authority. So my recollection, because this is when I was really reading comics at that time, you could get away with pretty much everything, anything in a code-approved comic. You could get away with anything aside from like full frontal nudity and basically those bad words that you can't say on TV. But again, influence, it continued to decline. And here we go. Whoop. All right, so one of my favorite things to come out of this, remember one of Frederic Wertham's accusations regarding Batman and Robin was that Batman and Robin were gay. Well, in order to remedy that, they introduced Batwoman, who was actually the precursor to the more well-known Batgirl character. But they introduced Batwoman to the comics. This is a character that sort of fell out of use after the 1950s. But when they decided to sort of reboot that character, 2009, I believe is when that was, they actually made her one of the first openly gay female superheroes, you know, in comics. So it's a bit of irony there. So the Comics Code folded in, I don't know if you can see the date there, but it at the top there, it folded in 2011. It finally stopped being used. Marvel Comics had, since the 1990s, they had opted for just an in-house rating system. They would just put like G, PG, 14, you know, MA, like on the comic to inform the reader. In fact, I was discussing this once with the comics writer Matt Fraction, and this is somewhat apocryphal, but it wouldn't surprise me. the guys, apparently one of the reasons Marvel decided to stop sending their comics to the Comics Code, because obviously they had to pay, for someone to give them the stamp, and they found out that the checks were just going to somebody's private residence. There wasn't even like a real like office for this thing anymore. And I think even by 2011, there were only 3 comic book companies at the beginning of 2011 that were still using the Comics Code. DC Comics was still using it. They had, I think they had also adopted for most of their comics like a rating system, but they still sent their comics targeted towards small children, like the stuff that was adapted from the various cartoons like Teen Titans Go or whatnot. They would still send that to the code for approval. Then Archie Comics was still submitting for approval. And Bongo Comics, if you don't know Bongo Comics, that's Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons and Futurama. So various Simpsons and Futurama comics. We're still using the Comics Code Authority. And of those 3, it was Archie Comics that finally said, you know what, we really don't need this. Also in 2011, in addition to the Comics Code finally folding, Frederic Wertham's research was made public. It was found that, guess what, guys? He'd fudged some stuff. He'd fudged some statistics to make things sort of fit his narrative. He'd asked a lot of like leading questions and misinterpreted and taken a lot of the statements from the kids that he was interviewing and like taking it like out of context. I've already pointed out like his comments about Blue Beetle showed that he'd obviously never read a Blue Beetle comic, but let's go back to that famous quote about Batman and Robin being a wish dream of 2 homosexuals. So it's often quoted out of context, and it's that he meant that this was as some sort of general statement about Batman and Robin being a fantasy that homosexuals would have. What his interview actually revealed was that he'd interviewed a specific couple. He'd interviewed 2 young men who were in a homosexual relationship. And he had asked them, so do you guys fantasize about being Batman and Robin? Right? To which they actually replied, well, sometimes, but we prefer to play Tarzan. But because Tarzan, unlike Batman and Robin, was not exclusively a comic book character, even though they were Tarzan comics. Tarzan, there had been books and movies and all sorts of other things with Tarzan. That would be like going after Harry Potter today, right? He decided to focus on Batman, which was solely a comic book property. And also, of course, you have to go into there's something wrong with being gay in the first place. That was, one instance of many where he kind of fudged his results. And again, it's one of those things, his heart was in the right place. He really wanted to help these unfortunate kids that he felt needed help. But in his desire to do so, he kind of twisted some of the results there. So today we still have the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which works with libraries to make banned works available and to pay for the legal fees of dealers, collectors, and creators who face obscenity charges. Because as I said, there were never any federal laws about these things, but sometimes there can be these sort of local ordinances and obscenity laws that technically the shop owner or the collector, whoever, is in violation by owning or selling certain comics. And by the way, this is their website, cbldf.org. And you can actually, I'll show you guys here, you can get a nifty t-shirt like this one. They actually, when the Comics Code finally folded, they bought the rights to this image, of the image of the little stamp. So you can purchase this shirt for them for about $20. Usually whenever you purchase a shirt, they send you another one for free. So you'll get this t-shirt and another t-shirt that they randomly choose for you. For $20, and it goes towards their cause. So censorship and issues with censorship in comics still continue to this day. In 2012, 1 million moms threatened to boycott Toys R Us over a gay wedding issue of Life with Archie. By the way, Archie has come to be one of the more progressive progressive comics. Yeah, Archie actually beat Marvel. They beat X-Men by about 6 months by having the first gay wedding on the cover of a mainstream comic book. Also in 2015, a college student protested the inclusion of 4 graphic novels in a literature course they were taking. So there are issues like these that continue to this day. At the same time, comics have more freedom than most mediums when it comes to especially visual mediums. Like they probably have a lot more freedom than most TV and movies do when it comes to getting their product out there. In fact, 3 works, Safe Sex, which is one that started coming out last year, Sex Criminals, and Lost Girls. These are very sexually explicit works. They're all very good, but the sexual depictions of sex and sexuality in them is quite explicit. Safe Sex is about a world where not only has non-heterosexual sex been outlawed, but kinky sex of any kind has been outlawed. Sex Criminals, I won't get into that, but I will say it's sexually explicit. Lost Girls is Alan Moore, one of the great comic book writers, same guy that did Watchmen, basically doing what's sometimes referred to as slash fiction, using Wendy from Peter Pan, Alice from Alice in Wonderland, and Dorothy and from The Wizard of Oz, but telling stories of their sexual awakenings. And when someone asked him, said he unabashedly calls it. He says it's pornography. Alan Moore says it's pornography, and somebody said, "Don't you mean erotica?" And he said the only difference between pornography and erotica is the amount of money that you have in your wallet. So there is a lot more freedom than most mediums. If you could, especially with like internet distribution, you might now monetizing, the thing you want to put out there. That's a different story, but you actually can. These are all put out by major publishing companies. Safe Sex and Sex Criminals are put out by Image. You can buy them in any comic book store. While there still are battles with like individual shops and collectors having to face obscenity charges, as far as the medium itself, it probably has a lot more freedom than just about any other medium that you can think of. So here are some of my references that I sort of mentioned here, but I also want to talk about a work that I consulted, a work where I got a lot of my overview on this, a work called The 10-Cent Plague. Really tells the story of this as it happened and the effect that it had on the industry, because I think one thing that I think often gets overlooked with the whole comics code thing, it's not just about the censorship. It almost killed the comic book industry as a whole. It almost ruined the industry. Lives are ruined, people lost jobs, publishing houses folded and were shut down. The great comics artist Wally Wood, while it didn't make him an alcoholic, he already had a drinking problem. His trouble with getting work in the 1950s definitely worsened his condition as a result of that. Also, something else that isn't talked about, it pushed a lot of women out of the industry. There were a lot of women that worked as writers and artists in comics who, especially they'd taken over jobs from guys during the war, and they kept those jobs when the guys came back because the demand was so high for comics. But a lot of the women, they settled, they got married or found other employment. They never came back to comics. And so to this day, comics remain sort of a male-dominated industry. So, well, anyway, that's all that I have. So, have any questions?
I put one in the chat from earlier, but I was wondering if you knew that, like, if there was a reason the interest shifted from, like, superheroes to other things in the 1950s.
It was sort of it was one thing that was kind of a fad, just like any fad. But a lot of it had to do with the little kids who were reading those comics were getting a little older. And I think especially for like the horror and crime comics. I know, again, I don't want to go into gender roles too much. But I know little boys, when I was a little boy, especially when you're 11 or 12, you get really into like gross things and scary things, right? And so I think that was a big part of it, was the shift maybe for the original kids wanting something that was a little bit more sophisticated. Also, because comic books were sent over to the GIs, during the Second World War, just as a form of like entertainment, a lot of them ended up liking comics and coming back. And they also, being older, had more sophisticated taste. And so, and wanted different things. And they wanted to, as well as greater interest in like war stories and Western stories. And Western was another big one, at the time. So I think it was one of those, it was kind of a fad that had kind of run its course. And like I say, we probably would have like Superman and Batman and maybe Wonder Woman if it hadn't been for the code, but we probably wouldn't have really any of the other superheroes anymore. So it is one of those things. It's a blessing and a curse. It sort of kept comics sort of in this box of always being like something associated with is just for kids. But at the same time, hey, if we hadn't had the code, superheroes wouldn't have made that huge comeback. We would not have Marvel Comics if the comics code had not been a thing.
Does anyone else have any more questions?
Oop. Any other questions?
All right. Well, thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Appreciate
Now I will get the recording of this and give everybody their extra credit for my classes. So
That's great. All right. Well, thank you. Everybody have a good day.
thank you. Thank you for letting me do this. It was fun.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.